CSPAN.
William Webster, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, will address the National Press Club. He'll discuss the relationship between the agency and Congress, as well as U.S. intelligence policy. Saturday on C-SPAN, beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific Time.
Up next, join us for a live viewer call-in program. We'll talk to George Wilson, a reporter for The Washington Post. He'll discuss the U.S. defense budget.
George Wilson, Pentagon correspondent for The Washington Post, and one who's written extensively about the defense budget in particular. How has the Defense Department's reacted to Secretary Cheney's proposal that defense spending be cut significantly?
Well, it's always bad news when the military has to cut. Generals and admirals never can have enough. So what's really happening is that they've been told, look, fellas, Reagan came in and you had a restructure by addition. Now you're going to have to restructure by subtraction. And that's always tougher. What goes? Who should take the biggest hit? So I can't tell you it's good news.
Who were the players in this besides Secretary Cheney? This didn't come out of his mind alone, did it?
No, it came out of the mind of Congress initially because basically they're more afraid of the deficit than they are the Russians right now. And then when it came down to the White House struggle, Darman and Bush thought that time is to retrench. And I think Cheney came aboard somewhat reluctantly because, if you remember, he was the one that said, let's not jump into this thing. Gorbachev isn't going to last. Let's not be hasty. But rather than be isolated like Caspar Weinberger was by holding on too long, he's decided to come aboard and start the cutting process.
You've written a series of articles on this very subject for the Post. This happens to be one of them from Sunday. U.S. begins revamping the military, $300 billion budget now, hard to justify. And this and other articles, there's a lot of information, and I just want to ask you about one of them. And you quote somebody as saying that the real struggle is between Richard Cheney and OMB Director Richard Darman, and somebody characterizes Cheney as the odd man out.
If he had persisted on going his own way and saying, like Weinberger did, we cannot afford to cut anything. But he's no longer odd man out because he is getting back to the head of the parade and leading the charge about we got to reduce. And that's the process we're in now. It's tough. It always is, always will be. And he is not refusing to go along. But he would have been odd man out if he had not bowed to the will of Darman and others that, hey, we've got to cut back on defense along with everything else.
So do you view that the administration is pretty much in line on the whole idea of cutting the budget?
They're in line as to it needs to be done. How much it should be done and where it should be done are the fights ahead. And that's still up for grabs, and Bush will be the final referee on all this, and that process is several weeks away.
We'll get some more details on the table, but first let me tell our audience that we'll be talking with George Wilson of the Washington Post about the defense budget cuts that are proposed, and you can join in that conversation by picking up the phone and dialing the numbers that appear on the bottom of your screen. If you live in the Eastern or the Central time zones, the number for you is area code 202-628-2525. If you live in the Pacific or the Mountain time zones, it's 202-783-2727. And if you live outside the boundaries of the United States, perhaps some military personnel stationed overseas, dial the appropriate country code, and then 202-737-6734. We'll go to the phones in a few minutes. What are we talking about in the extent of the cuts? What can we likely expect?
I think they're going to be dramatic. I think that once the cutting starts, the Congress will go further than the Pentagon. And next year will be kind of the first cut in the fiscal 91 budget that presented in January. And I think Congress will outdo whatever cuts there are talking about. So I go along with those who say we're talking about up to a third cut of today's military. In other words, you've got a 2 million man and women military. And I think that'll be cut between a third and a half by the end of the decade, by the year 2000. And in money terms, between 100 and 200 billion dollars, as I see it.
Talk a little bit about the premise of our current defense posture and why Eastern Europe, changes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union have changed that.
Well, if the bad guys aren't coming, and if the enemy's not at the gate, and the enemy is reducing his forces, and the President of the United States says it's safe to reduce our forces, as he has done by offering this mutual troop cut with Gorbachev, then it's pretty hard to justify keeping over 300,000 men and women on the line in Europe. If you have a threat that's diminished, if you have warning time that's increased, so it gives you more time to rush back if things do change, it's very hard to justify continuing the presence as if nothing at all has happened. And of course, as the Eastern Bloc kind of disintegrates, that's all the more reason to question whether you have to pretend that nothing has changed.
I'm going to throw out some jargon, and that is the military-industrial complex. How will that respond to, I think we're talking about a $180 billion cut over the next 3 years?
Well, that's up or down. Cheney, frankly, hasn't decided how much it's going to be, but let's say it's in that neighborhood. Let's say $150 billion over what they had planned. And how the military-industrial complex is going to respond is they're going to scramble and they're going to struggle for a smaller slice of the pie, and the priorities will shift to, look, if an airplane can do its job, we don't have to get the widget that we had in mind for tomorrow. We'll fix up what we've got. So those firms that are able to renovate existing weapons like the F-15, F-16 fighters, they're in better shape than somebody who's kind of hanging on for yet another new contract, because there's going to be fewer new starts and more emphasis on fixing up what we've got to make it good enough for the diminished threat.
Have all the lobbyists on behalf of any particular program been out yet?
Oh, they've been out all this year. Because, as you know, Congress cut the budget this year, too. And Cheney recommended that the F-14 Navy fighter be cut. He recommended that the Marines V-22 transport be canceled. Well, the lobbyists were out in force all over the Hill, even to the Grumman people distributing films of Top Gun to show what a great plane this was. So, yes, the lobbyists will be out in full cry next year as they have been this year.
And both those weapon systems survive.
And they both survive. It's very tough to cancel anything, because as soon as a weapon is tied to jobs in the politician's home district, he says, yeah, we got to cut the defense budget, but not in my area.
You've also written about the fact that there's talk about cutting manpower, which is not the same as cutting weapon systems or programs. What's the distinction?
Well, manpower is easier in the sense that you can fire a private or a major with a lot less strain than you can cancel a weapon. And also, if I take you off the payroll tomorrow morning, the savings are almost immediate on the spending side of the ledger. Whereas if I cancel a weapon, I have to pay you cancellation costs, and the savings occurs over a number of years. And if you're trying to get the deficit down right now, cutting manpower is a very tempting target.
What effect does this have on the career military people?
Well, it'll be very demoralizing. I mean, just think, you've moved 12 times in 15 years. You're a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, and suddenly you're told that you're not going to make it to the 20 to 30-year retirement marks, which enable you to get a generous pension. And you would feel, justly so, that the government broke a contract with you. And ironically to me, when we had the Soviet generals over at the post, that was what they worried about most, not losing the tanks or the airplanes, but how am I going to tell a guy who's decided to go in the Red Army for a career and live better than he would have lived otherwise, that he's got to go back to the turnip farm where nobody wants him and there are no jobs.
You mean,
so it's a wrench on both sides of the Iron Curtain.
The American military would actually be saying to people, we don't need you anymore?
Right. They'd say, we don't have a slot for you, and even though you've put in 15 years, Lieutenant Colonel, we'll have to do without your services, so you'll have to resign. And they indeed have done that in the past, but they're going to have to do it to a larger degree now than almost any time since Korea, if not since World War II.
How, in your judgment, how efficient was the buildup during the past administration? And is there any comparisons or lessons that can be drawn from the buildup to be applied to, I guess, the diminishment of the military?
Well, I'd rather quote Chairman Sam Nunn of the Senate Armed Services Committee, because his view is that, in effect, it was too much too soon, that we had roughly a 50% real increase, but we didn't get 50% more capability. And I think that President Reagan and Defense Secretary Weinberger left it to the services to spend this sudden addition of money, and David Packard of the Packard Commission argued that we didn't really get our money's worth. Now, those opinions will be argued, but it's very hard to be efficient when you're building up in a hurry and you're on kind of a binge. When you restructure by subtraction, as we're now going to do, the challenge will be to do it sensibly. And again, Chairman Nunn and others have said the worst thing we could do is say, okay, Air Force, you get a 10% cut, Navy, you get a 10% cut, Air Force, you get a 10%. We've got to do it a little more selectively, judiciously, but that's tough because nobody wants to give up his weapon and see the other service do better than he does.
We're pleased this morning to have a man here who knows what he's talking about. He's George Wilson, the Pentagon correspondent for the Washington Post. He's been with the Washington Post since 1966. He currently covers military affairs. He was a Vietnam correspondent. He worked for the Allied Français. Is that how you say it?
Well, that was just doing a little. No, I was at Vietnam for the Post. They're just giving me my French training. That's it.
Okay. But that was in Paris before joining the Post. Co-authored a book called The Bridge of No Return, The Ordeal of the USS Pueblo. Author of a book you may have heard of called Supercarrier. It was turned into a short-lived television series. And he attended Georgia Tech and Bucknell. And he's also the author of this book, more recently out, called Mud Soldiers, Life Inside the New American Army. When did it come out and what's it about?
Well, it came out late this summer, and it's about the guys who do the heavy lifting in the Army, the infantrymen, the Mud Soldiers. And what I did is I took a rifle company that was virtually wiped out during the Vietnam War in 1966, reconstructed the battle to give the reader an idea what combat's really about, and also the letters I've been getting from soldiers say that's the first time they knew what they were in for. And then I took the very same rifle company a generation later and said, okay, why does somebody join the infantry when they don't have to in peacetime? And what are they joining this Army for anyhow? Is it to be all they can be? Is it to just escape? Is it to get a job? And my net conclusion is that the kids joining the Army today see it as a step up, and they want to realize something. And the bad news is that the middle management of the Army hasn't managed to turn around and lean toward this new talent to keep them inspired. But we've got a second chance now. With the military being cut, we can be selective in officers and troops and get a high-quality small Army.
In your articles, you made a reference to the effect that such a scaling back would have on the military retirement system, and somebody said a chance to reform it. What do you mean by that?
Well, Larry Korb is the guy who said that. He's the former Pentagon manpower chief under President Reagan. And the military retirement system has always been a target of the reformists for good reason, that it's maybe overly generous to those who retire early, say at 20 years service. And, you know, an officer who's very skillful, we've kind of lost a good investment by letting him get out in his early 40s. So Korb and others say, why don't we keep military guys in the service longer, let them retire at 65, and also prorate the retirement system so that if I have to fire you when you've been in the military 15 years, you get a portion of your retirement system rather than having to make it to the 20-year mark and then get only the severance pay and not the retirement. So there's a lot of reforms that people want to make in the retirement system, and this offers an opportunity.
Quickly before the next call, or the first call, with half an hour left, what does this all mean for the stealth bomber, the B-2?
That it's going to be under more pressure than ever to survive. And my own judgment is that it'll never reach the Air Force ambition of 132 of them. There'll be fewer than that.
Our guest, George Wilson. The subject is the defense budget and proposed cuts. The first call for him is from West Palm Beach, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. My question for Mr. Wilson is related to the the cuts in the defense budget. If the military-industrial complex is faced with a 30% or 33% cut in budgets, is it not wise to shift some of that technology towards our space programs, and which has gained more technology for civil programs over the last 25, 30 years, and try to shift some of that talent towards our space program?
I think that's a good idea, but the larger question is, how do we fight this new battle, which is now economic rather than military? And there's a lot of groping here in Washington of, we know we're in a new ball game. We know we're going to be competing against the unified Europe economically. We know Japan is a superpower economically. What do we do now that our military is suddenly not priority number one? And certainly space, with its high technology potential, is one of those areas that I would think that we'd like to lean toward. But I have to tell you, we're in a state of confusion now because everything's happened so quickly.
Covington, Louisiana. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Collins, Mr. Wilson. I really would like to ask the Post through you, Mr. Wilson, if it would be possible for the Post to take a Gestalt view of what is going on vis-a-vis the relationships of the great powers right now, and as it impinges on the defense budget, particularly, it seems to be the possibility, and there's documentation for this, that the Gorbachev initiative, if you will, actually began around 1984 with the plan of, with a conscious plan of liberalizing or freeing up the satellite nations and liberalizing the structure of the Soviet Union. And it is difficult to believe that this was done purely for altruistic motives. It would seem to me, and it has been discussed among the various departments, that possibly on the agenda, Eastern European countries will very quickly be making application to EEC for membership or associate membership. If such an event occurs, it presents a tremendous new economic bloc in the world. And at the same time, with the possible reunification of DDR and Federal Republic, renders NATO as it currently exists untenable in Europe, all of which really seems to be under consideration with the Defense Department now and its budgetary moves. The upshot of it is that we cannot, the defense budget, I'm sure you will probably agree, at least in part, has been an economic engine in this country in directing or preventing major swings, recessionary, inflationary, etc., or at least been used in that in an attempt in that direction. In the cut in the hardware.
Tell you what, caller, could I ask you to focus your comments so we can?
I'm trying to get there as quickly as possible, but it is a fairly complex subject, as I'm sure you're aware, and Mr. Wilson's aware. But basically, let me try and bring it to some focus that if we are going to cut the hardware budget of the Defense Department, would it be possible, in your opinion, that these funds that are cut would actually be used in acquiring an economic position in Eastern Europe?
Okay, sir. Thank you. That's a peace dividend.
Yeah, well, the peace dividend, if passed as prologue, will quickly disappear. But the burden of your remarks is got a lot of agreement here in Washington. Namely, we've got to gear up for a new battle, an economic battle. And Senator Levin, among others, has said, look, we've got to have a better partnership between industry and government, or else we're not going to be able to compete in this brand new world.
Miles City, Montana is next. Miles City, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. Wilson. All of us know that the infrastructure of this country is in bad repair. The highways, New York City's sewers and water supply are about ready to fall apart. Is there, as far as you know, any creative way, any plan to use creatively the military, perhaps allowing them to stay in and guaranteeing a basic wage, their retirement, but then putting them to work, say for civilian contractors, where any wage that they would earn with civilian contractors in work on the infrastructure, such as the interstate highways and so on, could be used?
Well, I don't see that happening because traditionally there's always been this separation of church and state, so to speak. And whenever the military's tried to get into what they call civic action to build highways on Indian reservations or whatever, there's always a great outcry of that's what private enterprise is supposed to do. So frankly, I don't see that happening. But I do agree there's plenty of things to spend money on, but you have to remember that this town solves one problem at a time and always at the last minute. So right now what they're trying to do is get down the deficit. So although a national highway program rebuilding is a possibility, I don't think you're going to see that until we sort this thing out, and then the peace dividend indeed will disappear to other projects.
What role do our NATO allies have in such a dramatic cut in our budget, if any?
Well, it's an interesting role there because under the legislation just passed this month, if the NATO budgets are cut, the NATO defense budgets, then there's kind of a Graham-Rudman trigger of our own where, okay, if you guys go down, we're going to go down farther. So we are linked together here about reducing spending on both sides. And the big challenge of Bush and others is how to keep this thing from stampeding so there's no military in NATO, and there is a direct connection.
Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Go ahead.
Yes. First of all, I want to thank CSPAN for the quality of the product, which it gives us. It's tremendous.
Thank you very much.
I visited your offices during the summertime. I gather that you have moved into a new area.
We've just moved on the other side of the building.
What I saw before was very, very simple. And what I saw in regard to the phones, for example, there was one phone there which may have changed. My question to Mr. Wilson is this. I was wondering if any thought has been given to perhaps using the monies which will be saved from the reduction of defense spending to the reduction of the national debt, and therefore the interest which we will be paying every year on that national debt, or perhaps to revenue sharing. That's the question.
First question, yes. The deficit reduction is what's driving a good part of this defense cut, so that indeed will happen. As far as revenue sharing, that's had a kind of uneven history, and I wouldn't look forward to that anytime soon. I think first you're going to get the deficit down under the Graham-Rudman and other directives. Secondly, to use some of this money for the domestic side of the house.
I remember after the Vietnam War there was talk of a peace dividend. What happened then?
I remember Chairman Mahan of the House Appropriations Committee saying after the peace dividend disappeared, how come peace costs more than war? So it always finds a way of disappearing on us.
Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
What I'd like to ask you about is some restrictive legislation which discriminates against retired officers or retired military. And
are you a retired officer or retired?
I am.
How long you been out?
About 15 years.
Where did you serve?
Where did I serve?
What branch?
I was in the medical corps.
All right, go ahead.
Well, that restrictive legislation has to do with discrimination against the regular Army, and that some pay is taken away if you try and then join the civil service or do any other federal work, and there are other restrictions too that do not apply if you're in the reserve services. And it seems in some cases it's easier to get promoted through reserve ranks than it is through the regular Army. And I hope with our new chance to do a great many things in the service, and it's.
Caller, how old were you when you retired?
How old was I?
Mm-hmm.
57.
And how long did you serve? 20 years?
27.
All right. And what are you doing now? You effectively retired?
Yes.
Did you try to work after retirement?
Well, I worked for a number of years after retirement.
In the civil service, I mean?
I worked several years for them, yes, but it became less profitable than other things to do, and so I left the Cancer Institute and went elsewhere.
All right. Well, thank you very much. George Wilson?
Well, I'm not going to get into that whole can of worms, but as you know, there's all this anti-double-dipping legislation, and there are suggestions for reform, and I would agree that now that the door is open to any number of reforms, that what bothers you could be on the agenda. I know that Chairman Sonny Montgomery of the Veterans Affairs Committee has addressed these same kind of issues, and I see us chipping at them, but it's way too complicated for me to give you a 30-second answer on that.
Is it possible to summarize what Dick Cheney has in mind with these cuts as to where the cuts will be?
I could summarize it in his own words, which summarized are, we've got to get lighter, faster, and more mobile. In other words, if you bring the American military home after years of being overseas to a greater extent than any power since ancient Rome, then you've got to be able to get back from home to the world trouble spots. So I look for more airlift, more sea lift, lighter forces, and a pulling back from the front lines of Europe, the heavy tanks and other armor that's so hard to transport, and also the Germans can provide.
Does that mean more of these rapid deployment forces
right,
that we've heard of?
To quote Senator Cohen, it's back to the rapid deployment force.
Okay, back to the phones. San Francisco, go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning, gentlemen. I have a couple of questions to ask Mr. Wilson. I presently employed at the Presidio San Francisco military installation, and definitely agree that the Presidio should be closed. It should have been closed 1946. The waste is unbelievable. The second question is, has Congress looked at the cost of reservists? Now, working at the Presidio, I have seen the waste of money in the reserve part of the military. And I think there's a program there that could really be took a look at and cut down in saving money. Could you answer that for me, please?
Sure. I'm afraid the answer on both counts is bad news. First of all, there's been all kinds of attempts to close bases like the Presidio, which always seems to fail because of the political pressures not to do so. On your reserve point, the Brookings Institution had a pretty interesting study which said we talk a lot about the reserves, but frankly they're not ready to go to battle, and several theater commanders, including General Christ, have said that the combat support units just aren't there when we need them. But having said that, you're going to see more and more emphasis of putting our forces in the reserve, not less emphasis, because the way we're going to be firing as we back out of the barroom door is to say, all right, Mr. Citizen, we're cutting the active duty military, but we're doing more for the reserves. So the reserves are our new insurance policy. So I think that more money and more weaponry is going into the reserves rather than less, as you probably would recommend. But since there'll be so much emphasis on the reserves, perhaps reforms will be more in the order of the day than they are now.
I don't know if our audience is going to be able to read this, but this is a chart that appears in your series of articles, and there is, as they look at it, they can notice that one point is that apparently Richard Cheney has given up on the idea of a 600-ship Navy.
Right, that's gone.
What is it going to be?
Oh, it'll be about 500. They're talking 550 right now, but that'll go down to around 500.
And we still have some of our World War II ships commissioned.
Right.
What happens to those?
Well, they've got two problems. The World War II battleships take so many men to man, 1,600 a ship, plus they don't have their own air defense, and in a day when land-based air is a real threat, the battleships are going to have an awfully hard time competing against the newer ships. And so if you're an admiral and you can't have everything, you're probably going to opt for the high-tech that's got air defense, such as the Aegis cruisers, than to maintain these show-the-flag battleships. So I see a couple of them going down very quickly.
Sparta, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Yes.
You're on the air.
Thank you. Hello. Listen, this thing in Eastern Europe, this is from Sparta, New Jersey, has only been going on for about 2 months, and we're talking about cutting the budget like crazy. I don't see anybody over there doing it. Isn't it interesting this week that the Swiss voted 2-1 to keep their army in place, and that's in the middle of Europe. The other thing is that the double dipping, it seems kind of in Congress that Congress is saying double dipping after what they're doing. The morale of the military people is absolutely destroyed. I know that because we got some people serving in the military. They don't know where they're coming or going. We've made a contract with these people. We should keep it.
All right.
Well, frankly, I can't agree that a 500,000-man cut that the Soviet Union has already started is not significant. And so, like it or not, right or wrong, whether it's temporary or permanent, the Soviet Union is A, cutting its forces right now before we do, B, Bush and Gorbachev have agreed to cut them some more, C, the NATO partners are cutting their defense budgets and saying, let's get most of these Americans out of Europe. So I think those things are happening, whether you recognize them or not. Now, what we should do about them and to what degree are certainly topic A and B for debate. But we are restructuring by subtraction, and there's going to be a lot of pain and hurt and feeling of broken contracts, and that's always the case.
Wrightstown, New Jersey. Go ahead.
Hi. Good morning, Mr. Wilson. My question is twofold. One is, what is the reality he thinks of people being asked to leave the active duty military before their 20 years are up? And also, what is his feelings about the recent cuts in military pay hikes?
Well, I think that, A, the reality is there that people will be asked to leave the military, both active and enlisted. And for some of the soldiers, that's probably good news. They've signed up for 4, and they'll be able to get out in 3, 3.5. So that's going to happen. And the pay hike was indeed preserved to a large extent. I think it was 4.3%. So I think that they held the line pretty well on the pay hike. Now, the administration has said that we're going to have a smaller military, but we're going to take care of it. In other words, those who are left in are going to be kept on a high pay. We're not going to go back to the pre-Vietnam slave labor wages, and we're going to continue the benefits. So those who stay in the military, if the promises are kept, will continue to enjoy good benefits, compensation, and prestige. The problem is if you're suddenly invited out, it's not going to be a happy moment.
You've been at the Pentagon quite a bit. Is there anybody you talk to grumbling about all of this?
Well, there's, like one other caller said, there's tremendous uncertainty, and uncertainty brings all kinds of unhappiness. And, you know, in the real world, how does the mother, or how does the wife of the military person plan her future? And everybody hates uncertainty. So there's more apprehension, I'd say, than grumbling, because they're not sure what's going to happen yet and whether it's going to affect them.
Is there any feeling that politically it's just the wrong thing to do?
Lots of people are against doing anything right now until we see how the Gorbachev initiative sorts out, but the engine's already going.
San Diego, California, good morning.
Good morning.
You're on the air, sir. And please turn down the volume of your television set because we're getting some feedback. Okay?
Good morning. This is Bill Brown in San Diego. I'd like to inform Mr. Wilson that the national deficit is not the same as the national debt. The national debt is that which we owe. And the definite means of reducing the national debt by repealing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. That act in itself would reduce the national debt to the order of 50%. And our national debt is over $3 trillion. And the avoidance of this particular thing is caused by the fact that the international bankers don't want to have it happen. They're sharing in the returns that are being provided to the...
Okay, caller, now that you've made that distinction, would you like to focus on any of the defense issues we're talking about this morning?
Thank you.
All right, I guess not. He's right. The debt isn't the same as the deficit.
Right, I know that. I mean, the deficit is what you spend as to what you earn, just like it is in our household, and the deficit, the national debt is what I owe in my mortgage. So I mean,
okay.
We're clear on that.
Point having been made, we go to Gary, Indiana. Good morning.
Good morning. I was calling to ask your guest here, what are the possibilities of, since there might be troop reductions in Europe, for some of those troops to be redeployed to some of the areas where they're being hard hit with some of the base closings, maybe in the Fort Dix or Fort Sheridan here in the Illinois area, or I believe it was Chinook Air Force Base in Lower, Illinois.
I don't see that happening because when you reduce troops, one of the reasons for doing it is to save money, and you wouldn't save any money by just giving them a new job in another area of the country. So I see that possibility as very remote.
Is there any talk about linking these cutbacks with burden sharing, for example, getting Japan to pick up more of its own defense costs?
Not Japan. There's been some linkage between if you European allies do X, we will do Y. There's some linkage that way, but frankly, there's a good body of opinion in town that doesn't want Japan to rearm any more than it is, and that's very destabilizing for that region. They have long memories over there.
Baltimore, Maryland, you're next.
Good morning. First of all, for C-SPAN, outstanding. Keep up the good work. Secondly, Mr. Wilson. Mud Soldiers, great book. I was in basic training 22 years ago. Brought back some good and bad memories. Question, and also my son will be joining Army in about a year, so it's a great, anybody that's anticipating going into the Army, their children, I definitely think they should read it, give you a little bit of insight what to look for.
This is not a solicited call.
That's right.
By the way.
No, it's not.
I had nothing to do with it.
Book was outstanding. My question is, has the Army, top and middle management, responded to the book in kind? Have they responded favorably? And the suggestions you've made about retention, would you comment on that, please?
Well, I have to say that General Carl Vuno, the top soldier in the land, Army Chief of Staff, has written me some flattering letters about the book, calling it excellent. There was some heartburn at first from the top command because everyone wants to believe his organization is perfect. And I have to also say that there's been a lot of letters have come to me saying that I've made this must-reading because it makes our training more meaningful to know what the soldier is all about today. But the bad news is that there's still some resistance to sending officers through basic training to learn what it's all about and what the troops are like. But I like to think that it's made the top leadership and middle management think a lot more about how they could lean more toward this new breed of GI, and I think that's happening to some degree. And as I mentioned earlier, with the Army getting smaller, the opportunity is here again to make sure that if we're going to be small, let's really be good. And I'm kind of optimistic about the future, and the book has had some effect.
We just showed you some pictures from the book. Again, it was published later this summer. How's it doing, by the way?
Well, it's gone into a second printing, and it's sold out the first, so that's good news.
Austin, Texas is next with the author of Mud Soldiers. His name is George Wilson. He writes on defense issues for the Washington Post. Go ahead, please. You're on the air. Austin?
Hello.
Hello.
This is Rex Peavy in Austin, Texas. I have some recommendations and suggestions for decreasing our national debt. First thing I'd like to do is all the people that don't pay taxes at all to pay. The second thing is that all the perks that are taken by our bureaucrats, that they pay tax just simply on the cost for us to pay for their freebies.
Caller, do any of your suggestions have anything to do with cutting the defense budget?
Well, what the heck do you think I'm talking about?
Well, I'm not sure. We have George Wilson here because he's kind of an expert on that subject.
It's George Wilson because he's the kind of man I want to talk to.
Well, go right ahead.
Okay, Mr. Wilson.
Sir.
Why don't we approach this thing from the middle and go both ways?
Okay.
We got people that want to spend money overseas, and they want to take my tax money and pay for their own little frequency of trips. And hey, I'm staying home. I've been retired about 5 years, retired
military.
Navy, and I'm staying home, just paying for these guys to take my benefits away from me. I spent time in the Second World War and the Korean War, and another 30 years in aerospace and Rockwell International. I'm very proud of my total picture. I'm a hero to myself.
Oh, okay, sir. Thank you very much.
Yep. It's time for everybody to fly tourist. Austerity is the order of the day. That's fine.
Your series, I suppose, is occasional. I mean, you're going to keep going. What do you think the next area of inquiry for you is?
Well, I think we're going to keep having stories about what's being sliced in the argument over whether this ship or this airplane or this weapon system should be deleted. And that argument will soon leak to Congress, and the battle will be on as soon as they return from the recess. So we're in for a monumental struggle of what should be cut, and make sure you cut the defense budget, but make sure you don't do it in my home area.
Park Rapids, Minnesota. Good morning.
Morning. I'm one of the people you never hear from. I'm a Korean veteran. I have a vested interest in that country. And yet I am so disenchanted in the response of the Korean nation itself, the South Korea, about the way they treat America today. They're arrogant. They burn our flags. They are in absolute turmoil. I would like to see that all American troops be withdrawn out of Korea. If North Korea does invade them again, then South Korea's got a problem. Let them solve it themselves. But no more American lives and no more support to that country just based on what they've given us in return. And thank you.
Well, I think there are troops, U.S. troops coming out of Korea, but it's more as a economy measure and also the conviction that we've been there long enough, and if we leave some air power and some ships that would be in striking distance, that they can handle most of the threat themselves. But the reasons are not, as you mentioned, they're more as a practical matter.
Helmut Kohl yesterday proposed reunification of the two Germanys. Do you think, if that happened, if that was in the picture, would that affect any of these budget plans for the Defense Department?
Well, I have to say that it's kind of where we came in. If you really look at it hard, what the threat, the new threat is a reunified Germany and a rearming Japan. So it's kind of the World War II scenario all over again. And there'll be an awful lot of care as to how the German military is restructured, because there's an awful lot of fear over there about that rising up again. And yes, indeed, that'll be a big shaping influence.
I think we've got time for one call, this one from Long Island in New York. Where in Long Island are you calling from?
Southampton.
Southampton? Go right ahead.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Wilson, I'd like you to hear two comments that are made justification for increasing the defense budget, and I'll be brief. The first one is that it seems when all other arguments fail, they say, well, it's only a small part of our gross national product, which I don't think one thing has to do with the other. I think we should spend what we need for defense, and there's a lot of other uses for the money if we don't need it for defense. The second one is the domino theory. Whatever happened to that? We were told that if we didn't spend money and build up our army, the whole world was going communist.
That's right.
Recent events prove that this was just a lot of nonsense.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Well, I think history shows that the representation during the Vietnam War that communism was monolithic, that if South Vietnam fell, so would Thailand, has been proved wrong. So therefore, the Dean Rusks of this world were wrong in that contention. And I remember one time I was in Vietnam, and the school teacher was saying, how come I send my boys to fight communism in my own country, South Vietnam, and your president has his arm around the biggest communist of them all, the leader of communist China? That became a hard question to answer.
He also asked about percentage of GNP as not a rationale for a large defense budget.
Well, that's a legitimate point. I mean, I don't see what one has to do with the other, but it's always used as a yardstick. It's about 5.8%.
Finally, what is the actual proposed reduction in terms of a percentage reduction from year to year? Is it greater than inflation and significantly?
I think that's still up in the air, but the speculation is it'll start off about 2%, and then it'll get a little higher, and then Congress will probably double it, as they always do.
Thank you very much, George Wilson, Pentagon correspondent for the Washington Post. Appreciate you.